He found a starving Apache child. 4 days later, 3 Apache women stood at his door. Arizona Territory, winter of 1882. The wind came in sharp that morning, slicing through Reed Holston's coat as he rode toward the crooked stretch of fence he never liked. It wasn't the broken post or wandering cattle that brought him out there. It was something deeper, a pull in his gut that said something was wrong. He'd learned to trust that feeling. What he found wasn't a coyote carcass or a feed sack. It was a boy no more than 6, curled into the frozen dirt, like he meant to vanish. His skin stretched over ribs, fingers turning blue, a dusting of ash in his hair. No coat, no tracks, no one in sight. Reed didn't speak. He just wrapped the boy in his only winter coat, lifted him into his arms, and rode home through silence. That act, done without promise or plan, cracked something open in him. He didn't know it yet, but that boy wouldn't be the last visitor. 4 days later, they came 3 women with dust in their skirts and fire in their eyes. They brought more than the past. They brought a chance for something Reed had long buried belonging. And what happened next would reshape not just the cabin, but the man inside it. If stories like this speak to you, take a second to follow the channel and leave a hey. It helps me keep these forgotten Western stories alive one day at a time. Reed Holston had lived alone so long he stopped noticing how quiet it was. 6 winters had passed since his wife died in that drafty cabin, her final breath rattling like loose nails in the rafters. Since then, it had just been him, the mule, the cattle, and the silence. A silence he didn't fight, didn't fear, it just was. The stillness of a man whose grief had settled into bone. That morning, he didn't mean to find anyone. He was just following instinct. The north fence always gave him trouble, but it wasn't the post that pulled him this time. It was that familiar ache in his gut, the one that whispered something wasn't right. He rode slow, the wind biting at his knuckles, scanning the scrubland, like he'd done 1,000 times before. But today he noticed the thing that wasn't there, the movement that should have been. A shape lay slumped at the base of the fence, still as stone. At first, it could have been anything, a coyote, an old sack, a shadow. But when Reed dismounted and approached his boots crunching frost-bitten soil, he knew. It was a child, barefoot, no more than 6, Apache by the look of him. Bones pressing through skin lips, cracked fingers stiff with cold. His cheek lay flat against the earth, and the ash of some long-dead campfire clung to his hair like sorrow that wouldn't shake loose. Reed froze. He hadn't touched another soul in years, hadn't wanted to. But there was something about the boy curled in on himself like he'd already left this world behind. Reed didn't ask questions, didn't look for answers. He just took off the coat that had kept him alive the last 3 winters, wrapped it around the boy's frame, and lifted him gently. The boy weighed less than a sack of oats. There was no plan, only motion. No reason, just the refusal to walk away. As Reed rode back toward the cabin, reins slack in one hand, child in the other, the silence he'd lived with for years felt different. Not empty, pregnant. Like something had shifted in the air. He didn't rush. What waited at the cabin wasn't a rescue, but something harder, responsibility. Inside, he fed the stove with cedar, laid the boy near the heat, and began the slow work of survival. Warm water, washed hands, broth stirred thin with fat. Reed didn't talk. The boy couldn't listen. He didn't ask what had happened. He could see enough in the bruises, the grime, the stillness that clung like a shroud. The boy slept. Reed didn't. All night he sat in that old chair by the stove, rifle across his lap, eyes flicking between fire and child as the wind clawed at the walls. He didn't know what came next, but he knew he couldn't leave the boy to die, and maybe that meant something after all. The next day, the boy stirred. He drank from the cup Reed held to his lips. He watched, wary but not afraid. Reed said little, moved with quiet hands, cooked double portions, and split more wood than usual. The routine didn't change, but the reason did. By the third day, the boy stood near the stove on his own legs, trembling fingers curled around a tin cup. Reed watched him glance at the door. More than once. Like he was waiting. "Someone coming for you?" Reed asked. The boy didn't answer. Just gripped the cup tighter. Reed didn't press. But the question stuck in his gut like a splinter. And come sunrise the next morning, the answer came walking through the cold. You ever had one of those moments where you didn't know why, but your gut told you to stop, to look, to act? Reed did. And it changed everything. Because that boy wasn't lost. He was left behind. But not for long. Before we get to who came looking for him, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or state in the comments. This channel's growing fast, thanks to folks like you. And if stories like this keep you watching, go ahead and hit that follow button. There's more coming. The fire's just getting started. The boy never said a word. Not that first day. Not the second. But his presence filled the cabin like a song hummed low, barely heard, but impossible to ignore. Reed Holston didn't press for answers. He just did. Water fetched. Firewood split. Broth stirred and cooled. Blankets turned. His hands knew what to do, even if his heart wasn't sure yet what it meant. And yet something was changing. He'd lived for years by a simple rhythm. Do the next thing, then the next. Don't think past tomorrow. But now, with that small frame curled near the stove and those wide, silent eyes following his every move, Reed found himself thinking past tomorrow for the first time in a long time. On the third night, the boy stood, barefoot on the wood floor, still weak, still trembling, but upright. Reed watched him from the chair, not moving. The boy held the tin cup in both hands like it was something sacred. His lips didn't part, but his eyes flicked again toward the door. Someone was coming. Or maybe he hoped they were. Reed didn't say it aloud, but the thought clung to him like smoke. No one stares at a door that long unless they expect it to open. He didn't have to wait long. By dawn, frost still crusting the window panes, Reed stepped outside to fetch kindling. The mule in the pen snorted hard and backed away. That's when he saw them. 3 figures standing just beyond the rise. Skirts, long hair, braided moccasins, dust-caked. Apache women, faces worn by wind and hunger. No movement, no sound, just presence. Reed's chest tightened. He looked back at the cabin. The boy still asleep, then forward again. The one in front stepped ahead, strong, curved. Her dress torn at the chest, but she didn't hide. Her voice when it came was quiet thunder. "You have our son. Not my son, our son." It was a statement, not a plea, not a threat. Reed held her gaze. He's inside. Still sleeping. She didn't flinch. Just nodded. And waited. Reed hesitated, years of solitude making his instincts slow. Strangers meant risk. Especially in winter. Especially out here. But so did closing your door. He stepped aside. "Come in." They crossed the threshold without a word. The warmth of the cabin hit their faces and tightened their muscles with the shock of it. But it didn't stop them. The woman Asha, as he'd later learn, knelt beside the cot where the boy had begun to stir. He saw her before she touched him. And then he moved, scrambled into her arms, like breath returning to lungs. No one cried. No one spoke. They just held each other. The boy pressed his face into her chest. Her arms folded around him, pulling him back into something he hadn't felt since the day he was lost belonging. The 2 others lingered in the shadows, watching, but not approaching. One tall and quiet, eyes sharp. The other older, softer in movement, as if each step had to ask permission. Reed stood off to the side, uncertain hands at his sides. He poured water. Pulled out food, jerky, dried beans. What little he had, he gave. And when Asha looked up at him, her voice didn't carry judgment. "Why did you help him?" Reed rubbed the back of his neck. Didn't feel right leaving him. Asha nodded once. "No, it wouldn't have been." That night, no promises were made. No words about staying or going. Just furs laid by the fire, and enough space made for bodies that had known too much cold. Reed cleaned his rifle before bed, as always. But when he looked up, the cabin no longer felt like something fragile or broken. It felt like something being rebuilt, one ember at a time. Sometimes it's not the loud choices that change us, but the quiet ones. A coat shared. A door opened. A boy held close again. If this story is pulling you in, don't miss what comes next. Tap follow so you won't miss the rest of Reed and Asha's journey. And if you're still with us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. The fire burned low, casting long shadows along the cabin walls, and still no one spoke of leaving. Asha slept closest to the boy, her arm curved over him like a barrier against everything that had come before. The other two women kept to the edges, silent, cautious, but not restless, as if their feet, for the first time in weeks, had found ground. They didn't need to flee. Reed rose early, as he always did. But now the rhythm of his mornings had changed. There were more footsteps behind him, more breathing in the quiet. The kettle emptied quicker. The woodpile vanished twice as fast, and he didn't mind. He had once carved this life out of silence. Now the silence had voices in it. The women moved without asking. Tula, the gentler one, was always the first to stir after Reed. She moved like someone used to mending, used to waiting for others to need her hands. She swept ash-folded furs, tended the boy, when Asha's eyes grew heavy. Ren, the younger one, kept her distance. Sharp eyes, wary movements. She never turned her back fully on Reed. But she didn't run either. She stood near the stove now, her bare feet on the cold planks, arms crossed tight over her chest. Her dress was shorter, worn, torn at the thigh. Her calves were streaked with old dirt and cracked skin. Reed noticed, but didn't stare. "You're welcome to boots," he said plainly. "Got a few pairs. Might not fit." "Better than that." She said nothing, but Asha looked up from where she sat and replied low and even, "We'll take care of our own." That was the first time Reed heard the shape of their bond, not just three women from the same tribe, but something deeper. Not sisters by blood maybe, but by survival. By what they had endured, and by what they had lost. Later, Asha stepped outside into the dusk. She didn't say where she was going, only wrapped herself in the coat Reed had given her, brushed clean folded, and returned without a word. Reed followed her, but not closely. She stood at the edge of the creek bed where dry reeds rattled in the wind and knelt by a stone outcrop. Her lips moved in a language Reed didn't understand. Her back rose and fell with her breath steady and deliberate. She was praying, or remembering. He waited, not wanting to intrude. When she stood again, she turned to him, not startled, not surprised. "You didn't ask what happened to us," she said. "I didn't figure you'd tell me," he replied. She nodded once. "We hid the boy during the raid, covered him with brush. We ran. Took us days to find the place again. When we did..." Her voice trailed off. There was nothing left. Reed's chest tightened. The memory of another fire long ago flickered at the edge of his thoughts. A town razed. A family gone. Grief buried beneath duty. "You came a long way," he said. "Yes. You're safe here." She didn't thank him. Just looked at him for a long moment. Not with gratitude, but with something quieter. Trust. Or maybe it's beginning. That night, the women didn't ask for space. They didn't stay near the door. They settled in. Tula curled near the fire, her hands tucked beneath her chin. Ren sat with her back to the wall, Reed's coat draped over her knees. The boy Tojo, as Asha had finally whispered, lay against her side. Reed sat in the chair with his rifle across his lap, the same way he had every night for years. But this time he wasn't guarding against intruders. He was watching over something being rebuilt. The ghosts they carried weren't gone. Reed could see it in the way Asha flinched at the sound of splintering wood, in the way Ren kept a blade tucked beneath her sleeping furs, in the way Tula hummed only when she thought no one was listening. But ghosts need space to breathe too, and sometimes a warm stove and steady roof are enough to keep them from screaming. The past hadn't left these women, but neither had they let it define them. And for the first time, Reed Holston wasn't just offering shelter, he was being offered trust in return. What happens when strangers begin to feel like family? Stick around. The next part of this story might just surprise you. By the time the first snow clung to the eaves of the cabin, the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence Reed Holston had lived with for years, the kind that echoed too loud, pressing in on cold mornings and dragging long into lonely nights. This was the silence of rhythm, shared space, unspoken understandings. Each morning began with breath-fire movement. Reed rose before dawn, as he always had. Now he wasn't alone. Tula stirred not long after her movements, quiet, graceful, like someone used to avoiding notice. She folded blankets, swept ash, stirred the first pot on the stove. She didn't ask what needed doing. She already knew. The boy Tojo had begun to move on his own, soft-footed, curious. He followed Reed around the yard, like a shadow, never saying much, but watching closely. The way Reed laced his boots, the way he checked fence lines, the way his hand lingered on the mule's jaw when feeding. Asha often stepped into the snow just after Reed. She wore the same patched dress, but now it was layered Reed's old coat wrapped over her shoulders, a wool scarf from the back of his trunk tied loose around her neck. Her breath fogged in the air, and though her cheeks were red from cold, she never complained. She didn't ask to help. She just did. One morning she followed him to the corral without a word. The feed sack slipped from the hook, and she caught it before it hit the ground, held it open with strong, steady hands. Reed noticed her fingers were raw, stiff from the cold. No gloves, no complaints. "You ever ride?" he asked. She nodded. "Our horses were smaller, faster. Yours are stronger." He handed her a brush. She didn't hesitate. Inside the cabin, the warmth held. Barely. The fire burned near constant. Wood disappeared fast, but no one spoke of shortage. They took turns splitting logs, feeding the stove, keeping the water pot warm. Wren still stayed close to the shadows. She didn't speak much, but she no longer flinched when Reed entered a room. Her eyes stayed sharp, watching always, but her shoulders had softened. She began helping Asha near the hearth, dragging the boy's mat into place each night, and pressing a second fur around him. Sometimes Reed caught her humming under her breath. Not songs, just a sound to fill the air. One night after supper, Asha knelt by the basin and dipped a cloth in warm water. Wren sat nearby, her bare foot cracked and bleeding. Without a word, Asha took her foot and cleaned it gently. She wrapped it in cotton torn from her own dress. Wren didn't thank her. She didn't need to. The silence between them said more. Later, as the wind picked up and rattled the latch, Asha stood by the door, staring out into the dark. "You think they're still out there?" Reed asked from his chair rifle across his lap. She didn't turn. "The ones who burned our camp? Maybe. But they won't come this far. Not in this cold." Reed watched her fingers tracing the grain of the doorframe, memorizing it, bracing for what might come. "You're not alone," he said. She turned the firelight, catching the edge of her cheekbone, the curve of her collarbone where the coat had slipped low. "You didn't ask for this," she whispered. "No one did. But you didn't close the door." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Asha walked slowly to the stove. She sat near him, close but not touching. Their knees nearly brushed. She looked into the fire. "I lost everything in one night." Reed nodded slowly. "My wife. Pneumonia. 6 winters ago." They said nothing after that. The fire crackled. The boy shifted in his sleep. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and thick, blanketing the land like a quiet promise. That week, the snow didn't let up. It buried the fence posts, filled the mule's pen, sealed the land in silence. Reed worked harder, rising earlier, hauling water, clearing paths, feeding animals. But now, when he came inside, there was always something waiting. A cup of coffee, a bowl of stew, or just a face turned toward him. They had no plans, no spoken future. But for the first time in years, Reed didn't feel like a man waiting for spring. He felt like a man who had survived something, and who might just maybe be learning how to live again. As winter deepens, so do the bonds. But what happens when the ghosts outside the cabin aren't content to stay gone, stay with us? The wind hasn't finished speaking yet. The days came heavy after that. Snow thickened on the ridge. The sky turned the color of wet stone and the cold pressed harder, slipping through the seams of the cabin like it had a right to be there. But inside, something else had begun to settle, something quieter than words. It was in the way Reed handed Asha a mug of coffee each morning without asking how she liked it. It was in the way her fingers lingered a moment too long when she passed him the washcloth for the boy. And it was in the way their eyes met in the quiet, and neither one turned away. They didn't speak of what was growing. They didn't need to. One evening the fire was burning low. The boy, already asleep, curled beside the stove. Tula was humming softly while sewing a patch onto Ren's sleeve. The room glowed amber and low. Asha stood by the wash basin, dipping her hands into warm water, her sleeves rolled high. Reed was at the workbench, sharpening a blade, slow and steady. The rhythm of the file on metal echoed like breath in the small space. "You never asked what we were," Asha said, not turning. Reed paused. Didn't figure it mattered. She nodded once. "We weren't wives, not in the way white folks think. We were what was left." Reed didn't flinch. "What's that mean?" She turned to face him. Her voice didn't tremble. "It means they took the men, or the sickness did, or war. We were the ones they didn't want, or didn't find. They called us cursed, even our own, for surviving." He set the blade down gently. His hands stilled, but his eyes stayed on her. "You don't look cursed," he said plainly. Asha stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "You don't flinch when I say that." "I don't flinch at much anymore," Reed replied, voice rough. She stopped just short of touching him. Her breath warmed the space between them. Her hand came up soft and slow and rested on his cheek. She traced the scar along his jaw, an old wound, long healed. "You look at me," she whispered. "But you don't take." Reed didn't move. "You don't have to do anything," she added. "But if you want to, I'd stay." He still didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, he reached up calloused fingers, closing gently over her hand. He didn't pull her closer. Just held her there, skin against skin, breath for breath. When she leaned in, their lips met, not urgently, not with hunger, but with something steadier. Trust. Recognition. Her hand moved to his shoulder, his to her waist. Her body eased into his like it had belonged there for seasons, and still no words passed. That night, after the fire dimmed and the wind outside rattled the shutters, Asha didn't return to her place near the cot. She stayed by the chair beside Reed, thigh against thigh, her head resting eventually on his shoulder. Reed didn't shift. He stayed still. Because stillness, he'd learned, could be sacred too. Not everything that matters comes in speech. Sometimes it's in how you hand someone a coat, how you don't ask questions they're not ready to answer, how you let your body say, "I see you. I choose to be here." In the morning, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Tula said nothing when she saw Asha still seated near Reed, eyes closed in early light. Ren raised a brow but looked away just as quickly. Tojo never asked. But when he passed Reed a tin cup of water that morning, he held it with both hands, arms outstretched like an offering. And Reed took it, with the same quiet, steady hands he used for everything. But just as warmth takes root, danger begins to stir beyond the ridge. What happens when the past isn't ready to stay buried? The cold hasn't had its final word. The thaw hadn't come yet, but the snow had begun to speak less. Where once it fell heavy and fast, blanketing the world in silence, now it simply waited, hard-packed, wind-scoured, hiding footprints, too old to read. Inside the cabin, the quiet had changed shape. It was no longer the stillness of solitude. It was the quiet of people who knew how to survive, people who'd once fled and might have to again. Asha had stopped watching the door, but Ren hadn't. She kept a knife tucked beneath her bedding, the blade wrapped in cloth. She walked with her eyes scanning the tree line. Even in calm, her fingers curled like they were remembering how to fight. Tula cooked more than they needed some nights, just in case. She moved slower too. Less humming now. Reed noticed. He didn't ask. Until the wind changed. It was early, before dawn. He'd stepped outside to relieve himself and heard it. Not a howl, not footsteps, just the absence of natural sound. The kind that made the hair on a man's arms rise without warning. By noon, the mule was restless, the cattle spooked. Reed checked the fence line again. 3 posts down. Coyote, maybe, or something more deliberate. He returned to the cabin with his jaw tight and his rifle across his chest. "They'll come," Ren said quietly that night, without looking up from the leather she was stitching. Who, Reed asked, though he already knew. "The ones who think we died," she said. "The ones who left us for it." Asha didn't speak, but her fingers wrapped tighter around the boy's shoulder as he lay sleeping in her lap. Later, when the others had gone quiet, Reed sat near the fire cleaning his rifle. Asha approached slowly barefoot, wearing only the patched deerskin and one of his flannel shirts pulled over it. She looked at him not with fear, but with truth. "You don't have to fight for us," she said. He looked up. "I don't fight for people I don't claim," he said. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She never did. That night, Reed checked the door latch 3 times. He slept with his boots on. By morning, tracks had appeared. Not animal. Boot prints. 5 sets, heading toward the ridge. Ren didn't flinch when he told her. She just nodded. "They don't stop," she said, "unless something stops them." Reed stared at the horizon. He'd seen men like that before. In uniform. Outlaws who wore nothing but need on their faces and fire in their hands. The kind that didn't chase justice, just power. Or women who couldn't say no. He didn't say what he was thinking. But that afternoon, he began digging out the old rifle rounds from the crate beneath the floorboards. Tojo sat cross-legged nearby, watching without a word. When Reed looked up, the boy said simply, "Are you scared?" Reed paused, then answered honestly, "Yes, but not enough to run." That night around the fire, no one laughed. No one hummed. They all sat close, even Ren. And in that closeness, something unspoken wrapped around them, like a second skin. Fear, yes, but also resolve. A readiness that came from knowing the dark wasn't done with you yet, and that maybe it never would be. But this time they wouldn't be taken by surprise. What happens when men shaped by blood and fire come knocking on a door built by hope? In the next part, the wind brings more than cold. It brings choice. Don't go anywhere. The wind didn't bring the men that night, but it brought a question. It lingered in the space between every glance, every creak of the floorboards, every time Reed's hand hovered over the rifle. It was the question no one asked out loud. What if they come again, not just raiders or soldiers, but loss, the kind that knocks at the door and doesn't wait to be let in? But even in the thick air of waiting, life did not freeze. The snow began to shrink from the fence posts, leaving behind patches of earth like bruises. The creek, once silenced by winter, whispered again beneath the ice. In that whisper, something else stirred. Hope. It came quiet like all real things do. Reed noticed it first, in the way Tula began planning the garden out loud. "Corn won't grow well in this soil," she muttered one morning, brushing the frost from a patch of dirt. "But maybe. Beans are humble." She smiled when she said it. Ren started spending more time outside. She still carried her knife, but now she also carried seed packets Reed had long forgotten were buried in the cellar. She traced their faded labels with her thumb, like they were letters from an old life she was finally ready to answer. Tojo began sleeping through the night without curling against Asha. He had found a corner of the room he called his. It wasn't far, but it was his. And Asha had begun moving differently, not quieter, but with the house. Not as a guest, not even as a caretaker. As someone who belonged. She would hum sometimes, usually while pouring water into the kettle or folding the worn wool blankets. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the cracks in the cabin like warm light on old wood. One afternoon, as Reed sat mending a broken hinge, he looked up to find her leaning in the doorway. Hair-braided hands on her hips, dress gathered at the waist with one of his old belts. "You've got spring eyes," she said, smiling just enough for him to see. "Means what?" he asked, brushing metal shavings from his lap. "Means you're not just surviving anymore." Reed didn't reply. But she wasn't wrong. Something inside him had shifted. The way he looked at the ridge in the morning, how he checked the traps, how he listened when Tojo asked questions, it had all softened. Not weaker, just rooted. That evening, as the fire burned low and the wind gave way to a softer hush, Asha stood beside him. "You never asked what I wanted," she said. Reed looked over. "I figured if it mattered, you'd tell me." She nodded. "It matters now." He set down his cup. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just in body, in heart. I want mornings that start with the smell of firewood and the sound of his feet on the floor. I want a garden that remembers our hands. I want my sisters to feel safe without holding knives in their sleep." Reed was quiet. Not out of fear, just full. "And what about you?" he finally asked. She stepped closer. "I want you. Not because you saved us. Not because you didn't ask anything in return. But because I see who you are when no one's looking. And that man, he's worth waking up beside." The fire snapped as if answering. Reed reached for her hand, not rushed, not unsure. "Just steady. You already do," he said. "But what happens when choosing to stay isn't enough? When the past comes knocking, not for what it lost, but what it thinks it still owns." Spring didn't burst through the land that year. It crept in like it knew the soil still held memory. The first green Reed Holston saw wasn't in the hills, but in the garden out back. Tula had coaxed shoots from cracked earth, humming softly as she worked. Wren built stakes from old fence posts, tying string with the kind of quiet precision that came from having survived too much to waste movement now. Tojo, barefoot and fast, ran with laughter that no longer sounded out of place. He called Reed Pa without testing it first. It had been true all along. The cabin had changed, but not in ways you could measure with a tape. The furs were folded now, not scattered. The pantry stayed stocked, not out of plenty, but out of planning. The morning smelled like coffee and soap and warm bread. And at night, when Asha lay beside him under worn quilts, her breath against his chest, steady as wind through pine reed, no longer felt like he was waiting for something to go wrong. He had known grief, known how it hollowed a man out. But this quiet rhythm of choosing each other every day, it was something deeper, something harder, something earned. One evening they all sat on the porch. The sky turned to gold. No one spoke for a while. Then Asha looked at him, belly rising now beneath the soft fabric of her dress, and said, "We didn't choose the past, but we're choosing this." Reed placed a hand over hers. Tula leaned into her shoulder. Ren sat with Tojo tucked into her side, her fingers smoothing his hair like she'd always known how. The wind was gentle. The world was quiet. And the fire inside the cabin had gone low, but not out. No one needed to say it. This was a family, not built by blood, but by surviving the same winter, by showing up through silence, by loving without asking for anything back. And that kind of home, it doesn't come easy. But when it does, it stays. If this story touched you, if you felt something stir in the stillness, or saw a piece of yourself in these quiet lives, stick around. There are more stories like this coming. Stories about love loss and finding warmth after the longest cold. Follow the channel so you don't miss the next one.